Good afternoon. My title has changed a little bit because I have an agenda. A little blurb in the program was focusing on a section of the research. But I thought what could be useful is to actually present the model in itself. My other agenda or goal is that this is the title of my upcoming book. So you can look it up and check it out by mid next year. So I'm going to talk about queer dialectics and politics in Africa. I'm going to spend more time on modeling itself. And if time allows me, I'll give you the pretext to the case study that I was supposed to talk about. Now, why is it important that we start thinking in terms of modeling? In my 20 years plus of engagement as an activist and scholar, I have come to certain realizations. And I have some concerns that I want to pin down. And I think this is useful in a space like this where we're talking and thinking about decolonization of knowledge. First of all is that LGBTI issues are today very legitimate issues in Africa. They are talked about in all circles. But I noticed that by and large, interventions, whether they are by activists or even scholarship, still places the state at the center of the debate. That is, political power itself is given tremendous attention. And intervention have prioritized state-centered communication strategies. Therefore, what I observe is that the non-standardized, non-state approaches to understanding queerness in Africa have been pushed to the margin. So to put it in a language of this, or at least the framework of this conference, this larger work is really interested in talking about what part of queer life is being fucked with. And I'm interested in the everyday practice as a way of understanding agency and theorizing agency. The other concern I have is that by and large, scholarship and activism, we're still struggling to mainstream LGBT issues in Africa. And by mainstream, I mean enter the conversation. And that means that reliance on human rights framework are dominant. And we're not really, or yet, we haven't figured out a way to engage with dominant concerns and questions that are proper to the continent and important to the people who live there. So there is a bit of normativity even as we start writing and thinking about queer issues. But normative approaches tend to dictate what ought to change. Usually they don't come up with some sort of user-friendly map that tell you when and how change occurs. So they tend to work in solitary confinement. Yet I want to argue that any change that really matters is encounter bound. It is interactive. And out of interaction, something emerged that lasts as change. So in this larger work, the book I mentioned, I started to reflect a bit on my own journey. By training, I'm a political scientist, so the state is certainly important to me, state institutions and laws and things like that. However, I have decided to tackle this issue from a different angle, looking at film media. So as I said, if time allows me, I may be talking a little bit about the first one, Proteus, which is a film that recounts a love affair between a settler in the Cape of Good Hope, or Cape Town in South Africa in the 17th century, and a Khoisan man, an indigenous man. Now, why film? So this larger work is my reflection about the many progressive and regressive steps in state-centered activism in Africa. It allows me to think about the possibilities, but also real limitations of queer negotiation as a concept when one's sense of identity cannot easily be reduced to the life of an avatar, a sign of the self that is no longer anchored in any real self. So in taking on this work, my aim is not to cater to a particular school of thought or theory, but I want to enter the conversation about myself and emerging themes that speak to the relational dimension of everyday life in Africa, to talk about queer life and queer belonging. So these selected films, what I do there is that I focus on the symbolic interactions, negotiation styles, strategies that the characters develop in order to come up with some sort of larger framework, which I name African Queer Dialectics and Politics. So in these selected films, queer characters negotiate desire, power, and belonging in ways that embody and exhaust context-bound conditions of pain and rejection. Simultaneously, symbolic interactions, even restrictive ones, provide all queer characters with the instruments of emancipation within and beyond queerness. That is to say, that characters deploy strategic behavior in everyday interaction to stretch the boundaries of the possible in gender relations. They negotiate embodiment, they reinvent knowledge, and reconstruct power. So the idea of change here as a bounded concept emphasizes the fact that the self is never alone, nor does it fulfill the conditions of its own articulation. The self is always in precession, negotiating its own representation as simulation, testing and projecting itself onto new materials, and inventing the real beyond materiality as simulacrum. So what is it that I'm trying then to do? What I want to offer here is a theoretically focused contribution to African studies through the lens of the Senghorian concept of présence virtuelle, virtual presence, for queer negotiation as an ethical negotiation. For those who don't know Senghor, he was one of the most influential thinkers, especially in Francophone Africa, who relied a lot on art and culture and philosophy to rethink the place of Africa in the world during the early 60s. Now, why am I insisting on this idea of negotiation? I am certainly not saying that negotiation is the only way to be or act political. Rather, it is to recognize that as long as the socio-political field is made of willful subjects, strategy can be overtly subversive in many ways. Queer characters in this selected film do not just subvert power, they also make power and negotiate socially informed new realities and knowledge. The point here is that African queer writing can and should feel comfortable in writing about the modes of belonging and becoming. My choice of film as a medium, or as a media, is intended to ease identification with the substance of the issue without any other requirements. So let me talk a bit about my use of the term queerness and queer. For me, queerness simply means out of order, something that if previously existed is no longer recognized or needed as such. It has ceased to be in line with expected dominant convention regarding matters of taste and representation. It is the pestilent garbage that reminds the house master of yesterday's feast, but one that none, not even the servant, can dispose of totally. Queerness is the stink that pokes its nose at everybody's business while remaining untraceable and untradeable. Queerness is freakish, it annoys. The notion of queerness in this book is simultaneously something giving itself to nothing. It is evanescing. It is something that does something to the object-subject it encounters and chooses to respond either by flight, confrontation, or further cooperative engagement. Here I am deliberately giving movement to queerness and fixity, or at least contentment, to the objects and subject of its encounters, presumed normative and dominant and permanent. Queerness pulls itself toward things, places, and subject. It is not invited. It cannot elicit movement of any sort in other things, places, and subject prior to initiating its own movement towards relational possibilities. Now, what are those possibilities? They can be viewed as coming out rituals or simply understood as encompassing the various ways, some less spectacular than others, of bending conventions through the enactment of a conscious and strategic behavior that bring new meaning to otherwise a monotonous existence. It is this ability to be out of order, to claim positionality and subjectivity that is no longer ordered around, but seen as something to be dealt with either by force or negotiation, is what constitutes queer annoyance. By queer, now, I only refer to the characters that embody queerness as defined previously, and whose sexual and erotic attraction to other characters characterize them as homosexual in a broad sense of the term. Now, I want to share the model itself. African queer dialectics, therefore, seeks to reflect on the contradictions and dialectical, on the premises and contradiction of a dialectical approach to identities and the perspective that queerness itself adds to the understanding of subjectivity. I identify 3 planes as shown here. The first plane, this first section there, is a positive plane. It relates to the fact that ideas, images of Africa and its history work as meta-narrative that encircles all post-colonial subjectivities, including queer subjectivities. These meta-narratives create contingency for queer agency in Africa, an agency that inherits the contradictions of a continent's exploitation by external forces. Here, desire and the self operate by opposition to that which is alienating and disgusting by difference. The resistance against internal and external colonialism often bundles together strange bedfellows. So if we take ideal reason as the colonial moment, right, it produces hegemonic colonial identities, but Africa will be that difference, right? And in this plane here, everybody is put in the same bag, and queer subjectivity does not necessarily escape this movement. That's what I'm saying. The second plane, that is the other side, which start with the post-colonial movement. So what happens with the colonized is that they're going to engage in a new sort of dialectic, producing a positive anti-hegemonic colonial resistance, but also creating others, and that's what I call queer negations. So here in this plane, which is a personal and negative, because it is the plane of post-colonial simulations in two ways. First is the most obvious one. The most obvious one is linked to the vanishing differences in same-sex, same-gender desire. Heteronormativity assumes a position of a sign of negation. In this sense, is only one of the many hegemonic post-colonial attitudes. The less obvious, though, is the positive negativity of sameness in queer desires and modes of being. Negativity, which is the reflection of the profundity of Africa's trust in single multitude and multiple singles, such as conveyed in the philosophy of Ubuntu. Positive negativity, which speaks to and intersect with African performances of same-sex out of sacramental or ritualized enactment of social and spiritualized metamorphoses, as those that could be said to be encoded in practices such as voodoo. So what we see then is that in the post-colonial moment here, what is positive is anti-colonial, hegemonic, post-colonialism, but it is also the queer negation. It forces us to also think about anti-post-coloniality itself. And that is really what I see as the real challenge. Because in either way, it is a plus and minus. It's never full. You have some sort of consciousness, but you grapple with the fact that, well, am I being too westernized? Or I'm being not, a real nationalist, etc. So this hybridity of negation within this plane produces what I call queer annoyances. As queerness engages in this double task of its own deconstruction out of double victimization by colonial hegemony and by post-colonial certainties. So while self-affirmation may occur in this plane, I'm a post-colonial subject, it is only partial, and the ever-looming presence of a double negation condemns the queer subject to seasonal schizophrenia. Now the third plane, which means I will not get to my case study. The third plane, which is really the focus of my book, right? So the challenge here is the colonial hegemony is certainly there. The post-colonial splits. It's not like it erases totally queerness. No, the queerness is there, either as cultural practices, but it is the space where you can only come as half free, right? So how can we imagine post-colonial queerness in Africa in ways that are actually meaningful? So here comes the ethical question to me, and here comes the strategic challenge to me, and I call it, the second problem of evil. So the second problem of evil is that it is very hard to talk about evil without thinking that once you identify evil, you're better than evil. Okay, so it's like I'm saved by Jesus. I'm saved by Jesus. You're not saved, and therefore I'm better. I have to demonize you twice at least. So see, if we want to escape this problem, what should we do? And I'm going to end there. So this third plane is strategic, as it renders possible the positioning of queerness as the sculptor of its own destiny, no longer defined or limited to resistance against colonial and post-colonial negations. This plane speaks about the challenge of post-colonial queerness to define and experience itself beyond identity, non-identity dichotomies. Here, the strategic choice is an ethical one between, on the one hand, manic production and replication of pygmalionics, or cosmetic reasons and values that cultivate soulless, rigidified, indexed, homonormativized consumerism. Pygmalionics is arrogant simulation, negative entrapment of identity in pursuits of materialism as an end in itself. It gears identity towards ideal chases. So here we'll be talking about the problems with transferring Americanism to Africa and those sort of things. So we can choose that as a model. On the other hand, the other one there, is the choice is of an Orphic presence, a sensible animation calling back to life the trapped souls and fossilized materialism from the consumerism underworld. One has to envision an African queer Orpheus emerging from the substrata of an Africanist consciousness, knocking on the door of post-colonial reflexivity and asking to be let in and dine. It is out of this rhythmic encounter that the simulacrum emerges as a sacramental order of apostolic communion, not consumerism. It is a Senghorian moment of sacramental simulacrum where queerness takes hold of self-giving bodies, queer and African, communally eaten in présence virtuelle, that is, virtual presence. This is the theophany of the body love, fully restored to its careful sensibilities, away from the temptation of hegemonic pursuit, Pygmalionics, window dressing imperatives, stressful representations and appearances, and arrogant simulation of both African and homonormative subjectivities. So to conclude, African queer dialectics and politics is about the necessity and limitations of debating all legislative queerness and gender identity in Africa from the perspective of putting an end to or solving the seeming contradiction between African and non-African mores. The book then, as a bigger project, is positively anti-dialectical and negatively dialectical. That is out of ordering. My focus is to reflect on the usefulness of queer negation in African films through character performance analysis to render possible a rediscovery of an ethics of belonging centered around a theology of emotive presence and affirmation of sameness within post-colonial everyday interactions. Thank you.